highest honor in science and engineering. She's been described as a national treasure and perhaps the ultimate role model for women in science. But most of note for us tonight, it was her leadership that helped launch the original Interphase 50 years ago. I'm going to close by quoting the advice that she gave to a student when she was at MIT a few years ago. Quote, "If you're here, a door opened for you. What happens now is a function of what you do." Dr. Jackson, thank you for all the doors you've opened at MIT and the doors you've opened for bright young hearts and minds everywhere.
I have to lower the microphone so you can see me. Well, thank you for those kind words, Vice Chancellor Waits. So good evening.
Good evening.
I can't hear you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Let me just tell you, I'm so delighted to be able to join all of you, including my dear friend Priscilla Gray, this evening. You know, it is very unusual in a world of flux to be able to celebrate the 50th anniversary of any program in academia. The fact that the program we called Project Interphase at its inception, now Interphase Edge, has endured suggests that it has been an enduring good. The springboard that has launched so much talent into the world, so much of it here in this room. So allow me to offer a little bit of my historical context on the conception of Interphase. When I was an undergraduate at MIT, as Vice Chancellor has suggested, it was a different place. I was one of just 2 African American women in my class. It was a lonely, chilly experience. And although I was a very good student, I was not entirely accepted by my classmates and even by some of my professors. And this came in the form of women in my class in McCormick Hall not working with me or sitting next to me at meals, classmates not sitting next to me in class, my being left out of study groups, and so on. One professor even told me, and some of you have heard this before, after I sought his advice on majoring in physics, that colored girls should learn a trade. Now, needless to say, I was hurt by this professor's low expectations of me, especially considering, and this was a fact, that I was by far the best student in his class at that time. But after I wiped a few tears away, I decided after thinking about it that I would not give in to ignorance and that I would make physics my trade. And that choice has served me very well. Now, in the spring of 1968, I was deciding which graduate school to attend, more than ready to be elsewhere. And I was on my way to the Philadelphia airport after a visit to the University of Pennsylvania, which was trying to recruit me into the PhD program in physics there. And I was in a car with my sorority sister. I'm a Delta.
Yeah.
When we heard on the radio that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee. And we nearly drove the car off the road. But inspired by the courage and sacrifice of Dr. King and others in the civil rights movement, I decided to remain at MIT for graduate school, even though it meant switching from my first love, which was condensed matter physics, to theoretical elementary particle physics, where at the time, the MIT physics department was much more active. But I knew MIT, and I knew that it was the place where I was most likely to make a difference for others like me. And it certainly had a very strong physics department. And MIT needed to become a much more welcoming place for African Americans, for women, for people from all backgrounds and origins. And given, and I have said this, its outsized influence in science and engineering, I believe that if one could change MIT, one could change the world. And at the time, there were a minuscule number of African American faculty members or administrators to spearhead a diversity effort. So a group of like-minded students and I, including Fred Brown, who people don't really remember, a group of like-minded students and I formed the Black Students Union in my last year as an undergraduate and continuing into my first year as a graduate student. And we presented a list of demands to the MIT administration, and we did politely call them proposals. Now, in response, MIT formed a task force on educational opportunity to address the embedded issues and invited me to join it. In its infinite wisdom, MIT asked then Associate Provost Paul Gray to lead that task force. And Paul always said that this was, and I quote, his first real chance to exercise leadership of any form at MIT. He said that. And he soon demonstrated that he was a true leader, a calm, reasonable person who moved the ship forward during a stormy time. And Paul took what could have been an adversarial situation, and sometimes it was, and instantly identified our shared objectives. He immediately grasped that MIT could and should be better. And Paul told me freely that he had grown up in an all-white community, gone to an all-white high school, and served in an all-white unit of the United States Army. And I was one of the first African Americans he knew personally. Now, there was one African American woman in Paul's class who did not remain at MIT to graduate. But Paul was an empathetic person who could always pull something up from inside himself to find common ground with the person sitting across from him. As a teenager, he had felt like an outsider. And he had some insight, therefore, into how difficult that could be. So he was ready to listen, to learn, and to act. And thanks to Paul, the Task Force on Educational Opportunity spurred a breathtaking change at MIT. Until then, MIT had never done much recruiting of any kind. Why would it? It was MIT, after all. And for the first time, the Institute developed special recruiting materials and a stronger financial aid package for African American and other minority students. MIT began visiting predominantly African American high schools and saying to the most talented young men and women there, "We want you at MIT." Paul also had the wisdom to send the Black Students Union students, including me, on as many of these recruiting trips as we could manage amidst our studies, to prove to African American high schoolers that MIT was indeed a realistic possibility. And we had convinced Paul that merely bringing underrepresented minorities to MIT was not enough. Some of their high schools did not offer advanced science and mathematics. It was akin to asking Olympic track athletes to start the race meters behind the other runners. And these young minority scholars needed an introduction to the rigorous coursework of MIT and to become confident that they could succeed. So the Task Force on Educational Opportunity initiated Project Interphase in 1969. Now, Project Interphase was preceded by Project Epsilon, and that had in it about 5 minority students, not all African American. And so we started down that path with these 5 students coming to MIT in the summer before their freshman year. And in discussing what it should be called, I suggested, that Epsilon and Delta, particularly Epsilon, tended to mean small things. And so we should call it Project Epsilon. But Project Interphase was much more ambitious. And that in that first year, we brought in 57 African American students when 2 to 5 had been coming per year prior to that. And now I'm going to ask that first Interphase class again to stand, because these are my intellectual children. So would you all please stand and be recognized? And I personally recruited Curtis Morrow and Beverly Dowden to come to MIT. So Project Interphase was a summer program for incoming freshmen, open to all who needed it, with classes in physics and pre-calculus, among other subjects, and a wonderful introduction to the MIT culture. Now, I taught physics in Interphase from the beginning, and although I was a graduate student, I was placed in charge of the physics program in the second year. Now, as you can imagine, these were radical changes for MIT in the late 1960s. Paul was criticized on many flanks, including by some faculty members who actually thought he was lowering the quality of the student body, and also by angry African American students who felt that we were not acting radically enough. And some of my peers in the African American community called me a collaborationist or a CIA agent. It's true. For working so closely with the white administration. But you know, leadership often requires that one collaborates and that one does one's best to understand the different points of view of the people around the table. And so the students that Paul, I, the task force, and the Black Students Union helped to bring to MIT thrived and proved, not just to MIT, but to the nation, that brilliance in science and engineering is not the province of any single race, background, or gender. One of my very first students, by the way, was Sylvester James Gates, Jr. So he came to town from Florida with his umbrella. And I taught him in that first round. He loved me as a teacher, I'm sure he'll tell you. But Jim was brilliant. He became a distinguished theoretical physicist, was awarded the 2011 National Medal of Science, served alongside me on President Barack Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, and today is the Ford Foundation Professor of Physics at Brown University and Vice President of the American Physical Society. And this tradition of excellence has obviously continued and been continued by more recent Interphase alumni and alumnae, including many of the people in this room tonight. As you know, Dr. Paul Gray went on to other leadership roles at MIT. As chancellor, he created the first formal plan to increase the presence of women and minorities among the faculty, as well as the student body. He then became the 14th president, as you've heard, of MIT, and later chair of the MIT Corporation after his tenure as president. Now, he had many important accomplishments at MIT, including spearheading the undergraduate research opportunity program with Professor Margaret McVicker, which also launched in 1969. However, he always cited increasing the diversity of MIT as his most important accomplishment. Indeed, when Paul Gray arrived at MIT as an undergraduate, fewer than 1 in 50 MIT students was a woman or an underrepresented minority. By the end of his tenure as president in 1990, women were more than 30% of incoming undergraduates, and underrepresented minorities were 14%. Now, as for me, the Task Force on Educational Opportunity and Project Interphase were my first opportunities for leadership. Because I demonstrated that I could excel in my studies and do physics research well while addressing a complex societal problem, such as the dearth of minorities at MIT. I was offered many more leadership and policy-making positions and have had the wonderful career in life that I have had. Indeed, shortly after earning my doctorate in theoretical physics at MIT, I was elected to the MIT Corporation, where I today am a life member. I've been a member of the corporation since 1975. Now, Paul and Priscilla Gray became lifelong friends of mine. Paul was a great sounding board, a great advisor, and a great champion who advocated for me for important positions, including the chairmanship of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the presidency of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where in fact we recently celebrated the 20th anniversary of my inauguration as president. And Priscilla was always down to earth, and I would visit them, particularly in Rhode Island, and she always fed me well. And, put up with my going through the latest life travails. But in fact, Paul and Priscilla attended my inauguration as president of Rensselaer in 1999. So Interphase played a role in altering my life trajectory as well, as it assuredly has altered the trajectories of everyone in this room. And so it is a great honor to join all of you this evening and to be recognized alongside Dr. Paul Gray. Now, I often have spoken of the quiet crisis, our inability to attract and retain underrepresented minorities and women in science and engineering, as we face the risk of slowing immigration of talent from abroad. It is quiet because we do not totally realize or embrace that it is happening when it is happening. And it takes decades to educate a high-functioning science and engineering workforce. And so it is a crisis when it's fully upon us. And that is why Interphase was and is so important. More than anything else, Interphase proves that when people of goodwill and focused intent join forces, they can indeed change the world. Thank you very much.